Do not believe a single word that comes out of any mainstream media outlet unless you value news and information that's filtered by the intelligence agencies. That's what we're going to talk about in this video. Hey Rachel, Colonel Towner Watkins, thank you so
Hi.
much for making yourself available.
Sure.
And we did a fabulous program about NATO and why it's a good thing that NATO is on the way out and what NATO's been up to in the history. So I do recommend people check that out. And in this one, we're going to talk about the mainstream media. Now, I know that the mainstream media is full of all kinds of nonsense and lies and distortions. And I always had it as sort of, government propaganda or journalist bias or corporate bias. But apparently it's more than that. The spooks are involved.
So, for those of you who watched the previous video about NATO, and you understand that the intelligence agencies and their paramilitary forces have been all over the world doing all kinds of nefarious things, you have to ask yourself if any of that information was new to you, how is that? Because many people around the world know everything that I just talked about in the previous episode about how this goes in and overthrows governments. And no one in the United States, very few people in the UK and in Europe know anything about it and about their country's government's involvement in it. You cannot do that since 1948 without control of the media. You absolutely cannot do any of these operations without controlling the media. Because, and let me give you a great example. When we tried to do the Bay of Pigs, right? One of the independent, and this guy really was independent, one of the independent reporters that was in Miami when so the plan was we were going to have a whole bunch of bombers go bomb Cuba from launching from Nicaragua. Two planes of the mass that was launched was going to come fly directly to Miami. And they had camouflaged the airplanes to make them look like Cuban airplanes. They were CIA airplanes, but they were going to have two Cuban exiles living in Miami. They train down in Nicaragua, fly directly to Miami and say, I just left Cuba. I'm a Cuban Air Force officer and I bombed my own country and I'm seeking refuge in the United States. And that was going to be how the United States found out that the Cuban Air Force and the Cuban Army, but they weren't the Cuban Army, they were the exiles that we had just taken over there for the Bay of Pigs is we're in the middle of a revolution. We're overthrowing Castro. The problem was when the airplane landed, it was not the same model. It was the same type of aircraft. It wasn't the same model that the Cuban Air Force was flying. And they had modified it with a whole bunch of Gatling guns on the front of it. And they
Mhm.
were all like duct taped up. And someone got a close up picture of that and ran the story that the entire story of that guy coming here saying that he was from the Cuban Air Force was a lie because he didn't even fly the right airplane. And that story that day got back to JFK, and that's the reason why he canceled the second round of bombings into Cuba, which supposedly the CIA in America, the CIA had all of their media assets say that JFK chickened out and didn't authorize the second flight and never mentioned this story because that story, although it was printed locally, didn't make any of the mainstream media newspapers because it would have outed the entire operation. So the CIA is able to call the Washington Post, the New York Times, and tell them what to print and what not to print. And in 1975, when the Church Committee and all of the Rockefeller Commission was investigating the intelligence agency, they came out with a list of like over 50 media organizations. at the time, well, earlier, not in the mid 70s, but earlier than that, a proprietary CIA company owned ABC. ABC was one of the three networks in America,
Hmm.
and it was being ran by the CIA. And they had reporters on their payroll at NBC and CBS and um, the Time Life magazine. That's probably the most glaring one. Time Life magazine was the Henry Luce and Claire Luce. Now, you won't be at all surprised now that I explained Operation Gladio to you to know that Claire Luce was the ambassador to Italy. So she was there when a whole bunch of the Operation Gladio crap was going on in Italy and part of it. So she is a media empire person in America running Time Life magazine with her husband. And the
Wow.
JFK assassination tape, the Zapruder film, was found in the Time Life magazine's company vault, not in the CIA, in their personal company vault.
Wow.
So, yeah. So, if you understand how integrated the CIA is into the national media landscape, you understand. And the same is true with MI6 and MI5 in the UK.
Mhm.
They own the media. I mean, there's a reason why Robert Maxwell owned all of the media companies there, the medical journals, so they could control what medical studies got printed. He was an intelligence operative.
Okay. Now, I read something recently that MI5 interviews BBC journalists who are applying to work for the BBC.
I would not doubt that at all.
Okay, how do they get away with this?
We allow
Does no, but what I mean is the administrations, do they give them permission or they're doing it anyway?
Well, I've made the argument that the intelligence agencies do not work for the government. They work for oligarchs. Um, the it's nice if you have a government that is bought and paid for and installed, like we have with Biden or Obama. They're in on it. But every once in a while, you'll get a renegade in there, a real renegade like Trump, who isn't part, or JFK, that isn't part of their operation. And that's when this relationship is critical. The rest of the time, because then it's turned on them.
Mhm.
But the rest of the time, it's turned on us, the people. So if everybody in the government, the head guys, the State Department guy, the president, and the CIA, if they're all on the same sheet of music, they just use their media contacts to basically psychological manipulate us, right? The people. But occasionally you'll get a Trump in there, and that needs to be turned on them and us at the same time. So it just depends on whether one of their operatives is sitting in the White House for us or not. And that certainly has happened.
Okay. Okay. And then I imagine this goes on in lots of different nations that they have their spooks
Oh,
embedded looking
oh
after the
yeah.
media and stuff. Certainly in China and Russia, for sure, North Korea, Ireland,
Well,
Britain.
North Korea doesn't have any independent media. I don't know of any independent media in China. I know there are independent media in Russia, because you will find stories in Russia that is at least objective, not critical, but objective on different things. But it does. But let me one of the and I want to explain to people how this operates. So when the CIA had gotten orders to overthrow the government of Chile back in 1973-74 timeframe, the CIA had bought through a proprietary company their version of the New York Times in Chile. They
Mhm.
were actually running the paper. And of course, the paper was then very critical of Salvador Allende and his government and literally critiqued every single thing he did. And that's how they manipulate the people by generating this backlash against the government. But doing all of this research, I did a show about how they manipulate the media. And I was doing a little bit of research because now we have social media,
Mhm.
right? And a lot of our social media in and large companies for that matter, like Google, all started out as basically a DARPA project. And DARPA is it's under the Defense Department, but or the Secretary of War now, but it is embedded with CIA people throughout every office there, the leadership there, former CIA. And so it's really a hybrid between the CIA and the Department of War. And DARPA does all of the research into all kinds of things. And so when the internet was being developed and technology, they created a program called LifeLog, and LifeLog was turned off one day, and Facebook is turned on the very next day. And Facebook is basically LifeLog. It is basically an intelligence project. The same thing is true with Google. What I found very interesting about Google as it relates to media is Google has this massive cloud company, right? Cloud storage. Well, I started looking into its relationship with the CIA, and I found out that, and I don't remember the exact year, but the CIA awarded a contract to Google for cloud storage for $600 million. And 4 months later, Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post for $400 million.
Just a
And I
co
was like,
just a coincidence. These happen all the time, Roxanne.
that's a really weird coincidence.
Yes.
And that's how they did the company down in Chile through a front company. They were given an award of, and then they used this front company to then purchase the local paper
Right. Okay. Because no government would be happy with the CIA coming along and buying up the big,
directly.
yeah,
Right.
directly. Yeah. They'd have to do it by proxy. So then during the COVID and lockdown period, the messaging that was given out that these incredibly wonderful medical interventions are really, really safe and effective. And you
Yeah.
should get 6 boosters every day because they're that effective.
Right.
That would have been done with the either under the instructions or the complicit knowledge of the CIA.
Yes.
And but it was global, right? So then local intelligence
But
services as well?
we just of these
Okay.
sibling organizations all over the world. And it is a cohesive operate when you're going to do something like a COVID and it's going to be a global thing. They already had planning meetings on how, if we have a pandemic, this is how the whole thing's going to unfold. And so that all of this stuff is pre-planned.
Right. Yes. Okay. And then with regards to certain wars, they can have the outlets produce certain messages.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so then what's the relationship between Trump and the mainstream media and the spooks? Because he's okay, naive question coming up, okay? He's the president of the United States. The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency for the United States, why
Mhm.
is it pushing out anti-Trump propaganda through the mainstream media?
So again, this you I believe that uh, Radcliffe is not part of the nefarious, but you have to understand how the CIA is set up. I would doubt very seriously if the nefarious people in the CIA has even and briefed him on a lot of the stuff that they do.
Hmm.
So if the CIA has been, in existence for 75 years, generally under favorable leadership, everybody in that entire organization was hired from the previous administration, from the one before that, from the one before that. And so you're promoting up these people that are all in this nefarious, and
Right.
you also have to understand that their allegiance is not to the United States, and it's certainly not to the president. It's to this oligarch class that runs everything. And so, in the past, Rockefeller, if he wanted to have favorable coverage of like the Guatemalan coup or the Chilean coup or whatever coup he was behind, um, he would just pick up the phone to Dulles, or whoever was the CIA director, and he'd say, "Hey," and it's a very uh, it appears informal to us, but it's a very formal thing.
Hmm.
So these media people get invited to the Bilderberg meetings, right? They get to go to all of these um, organizations. So they have their own networks. So even if the CIA's director is in hostile hands, they can still operate this network underground. It does not require the director or the president's approval to do any of this.
Right.
So if the CIA, and they have done this, um, is at Harvard, and they have selected a whole bunch of media people. They have CIA agents embedded in the journalism schools. They have institutes on these campuses that are CIA fronts. And they recruit these people into this network. And so then they help them get jobs, because they're like, I can call Jeff Bezos and I can get you, this job. It's like the what's the guy's name? I'm not going to remember it, for Watergate. Bernstein and the other guy. Crap.
Let us know in
The
the
other,
comments below. I remember Bernstein. I
yeah,
remember the other
the
guy.
other, oh shoot, I can't believe I can't remember his name, but not Bernstein. The starts with Wood, Woodward and Bernstein.
Yes.
So Woodward had been this Navy intelligence guy, and he had been involved in all kinds of nefarious stuff, even at a junior rank in the Navy. He had all of these. He was like in the meetings with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and had all of this. That doesn't happen. I spent my time. His career is something that's crazy.
Mm.
Okay, so he gets plopped out of the Navy and put as a reporter on the Washington Post. That's not how that works either. You have to be a stringer. You have to go and do all of this other stuff before you ever get the job. But he got the job. And then not only did he get the job, he got all of the, he's this nobody in media, or in journalism, gets all the deep throat from Watergate. No, that's
Wow.
not how any of that works. And so when you go back and you start looking at these things, you understand that their players are put in all of the right places to do all the right things. And the most telling of all of this is people like Pete Bruton. Pete Bruton wrote he wrote a book. It got turned into a book. He was working at a paper in Houston, and he stumbled across the fact that the elite, like George H.W. Bush, Jim Baker, and all of these guys that were from the Houston area, was involved in the savings and loan crash in the 1980s. And one of the Bush sons, Neil Bush, out in Colorado, ran a savings and loan out there. They were all money laundering for the drugs and the mafia. Okay, that's what the savings and loan crisis was all about. So Pete Bruton stumbled on that, starts writing articles. He basically gets fired from the paper because he was exposing all of this.
Mhm.
Gary Webb, who's the one that exposed the Iran Contra in a newspaper out in California called the Mercury. And no mainstream media newspaper would pick up a single story he wrote. Not the LA Times sitting right next to him, not the New York Times, not the Washington Post. They totally blacked out everything that he was reporting on, and then they got him fired.
Wow. Wow, 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 wow. Got me thinking about uh, Barack Obama and The Guardian. So when Tulsi Gabbard first came out with the allegation that Obama was involved with getting Russiagate going,
Mm-hmm.
it was they published an article about it in The Guardian. And then they also had something else about about Obama, where Obama responded and said this was completely baseless. There was no substance to it whatsoever. And then a week later, the Guardian, Tulsi Gabbard comes out and produces some receipts, some evidence to back up what she said, plus some more stuff. She regularly unveils more and more information. I think that was in the first story was in the Guardian last summer, July. Since then, nothing. The Guardian
Mm-hmm.
just doesn't mention it at all. Even as more and more information comes out and Tulsi
Yeah.
Gabbard releases more and more, they just don't mention it. So now I know that because I followed that, and occasionally I punish myself by having a look at the Guardian or the BBC, right? But something happened with the Guardian. I can't remember when it was, a few years ago, when the British intelligence services took the servers, or they wanted access to the servers because I think was it Snowden or Chelsea Manning, something to do with that. And ever since then, the Guardian has turned and no longer in any because they published the Snowden papers. So they had access to
Yeah.
all that information. And I think the editor refused to hand over the servers. Don't think he stayed the editor for very long. They got
No,
another
I
editor.
doubt. Yeah. And
Okay.
this has been, again, they call it Mockingbird Media for a reason. There's so many clips out on social media about the news in America parodying the exact same terminology from Florida to California to Tennessee.
The
They get
walls are
talked.
the walls are closing in, Roxanne. I still
Yeah,
remember
yeah,
that one. Yes.
yeah, yeah. And so, the weird thing to me is all of this was exposed. Not a single person went to jail. No one was held accountable. And then people act surprised that nothing changed.
Mm.
Well, why would it change? If they've gotten away with it and it got outed in the 1970s and nobody went to jail, and the only purpose of it is to propagandize your own domestic people. And that's against the law in America for the CIA to be writing talking points for the media. That's
I
literally against the law and no jail.
okay. Okay, but this Obama repealed the Smith-Mundt Act that prevented the government from propagandizing its own people.
We had the Smith-Munn Act in the 1970s and it didn't do a bit of good. That's why every time somebody brings that up, I'm like, who gives a shit?
Come
So
on,
they
the
they
CIA
removed
wouldn't
the
break
law.
the
They
CIA
removed.
wouldn't Sorry, Roxanne, the CIA wouldn't break the law. What are you talking about?
That's my whole point. The in the 1970s, they didn't pay any attention to that law. They
Right.
didn't pay any attention to it in the 60s. The fact that he repealed it, who cares? So now they just legally won't go to jail. You didn't make them go to jail before.
Fair point. Okay. All right. So then you said the CIA needs to be broken up. How to accomplish that?
So I said when Trump was coming to office, day one, because his first term he went to the CIA right away and gave them a briefing. I thought he needed to get on his helicopter that morning, fly over to the CIA with, Mr. Real Estate Guy, plant a for sale sign in front of the CIA headquarters, go in there, tell everybody to leave, and lock the door. Then I would detonate the whole building. I would put radioactive waste on top of it, bury it so no one would ever touch it again. That's my solution.
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's something that's going to be able to get past the quality controllers in government and everything, right?
I probably think it won't, but that would be my solution because that's
Right.
how radioactive it is. It would just be fitting for it to be buried in radioactive waste because it has been responsible for the murder of millions, at least 10 million
Wow.
people around the world since 1948.
Wow. Okay. All right. But even if the CIA were got rid of, then they would just go underground like they did under JFK.
So here's the bright spot of that though. They will not have any of the government networks to use um, in 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 that case. So they're going to have to create networks outside of government in order to continue doing this. And what I have tried to explain to people is that I obviously am not going to get my wish, but using the current system, when if you were to envision a water source at the top of a mountain, and the water comes down, and there's nooks and crooks as it comes down. When you build a barrier halfway down the mountain and you reroute that water, the people that were being fed by that water stream, and I'm talking about intelligence networks,
Mhm.
um, the people that were being fed by that stopping are now going to starve, right? So these people are going to energize alternative ways of getting water or money from the CIA.
Right.
And soon as they do that, the same thing that they were using to spy on us is being spied, focused on them.
Right.
So they basically light up. They are on the phone, they're on their satellite phone, they're trying to contact people, and all of that's being traced. So when we started taking out drug boats in the Caribbean, um, those networks downstream of that lit up like a Christmas tree, right?
Mhm.
So so did the people who had supplied that cocaine to put on them boats, because now they're not going to get money for their product. So they were on the phone. And every one of these nodes that gets knocked out in this network, I don't know if you've been paying attention to the amount of money laundering people that are getting picked up. There's massive arrests all over. UBS in Switzerland and Deutsche Bank and all of these different large um, banks are getting hit with all kinds of money laundering. There was a big thing that just happened in Thailand as well. And so, as these things get taken offline, everything that it was feeding downstream lights up, and so does the people that were feeding it from the top. And so I believe there's this massive operation going on. Iran was one of the big conduits for a lot of these operations as well. And so they're all offline now. And the more and more of these that get knocked out, the more people. And so then you're able to take out not just the downstream networks, but the upstream networks as well.
And okay, and that needs to be
Because in
done.
the past, to your point, that's exactly what did happen. In the 1970s, after all of that stuff got revealed, the media and all of that stuff in the church committee and all of those things that happened in the mid 1975s, Jimmy Carter comes in and fires over 800 covert operators in the CIA. It was called the Halloween Massacre. It's something no one ever talks about. And those people basically just moved out of the building into proprietaries that the CIA had set up and waited for Reagan.
Right.
And there was a lot of manipulation of the Jimmy Carter presidency that occurred to make sure that Reagan was the next guy. And of course, he brought in George H.W. Bush, who's Mr. CIA himself, as his vice president, and they just rebuilt that network. Or moved it back into the building. It existed the entire time it was out of the building, and they set up things like the Safari Club over in Kenya. I don't know if you've ever read about that, but that was and a guy, you'll know this guy maybe, Brian Cozy. He was from the UK. He set up an organization called Six Eye, like, we have five eyes. It was Six Eye, and it was a private intelligence organization as well. So there are alternative feeders when you get taken offline like that, but they don't have the protection of claiming national security because
Mhm.
they're rogue individuals. And so they're at a much bigger vulnerable when you're doing it not state ran. You can be picked up a lot easier. The CIA gets away with all of this because they classify everything under national security and protection of diplomatic immunity and all of that other stuff. These rogue organizations have none of that, and they can be rolled up a lot easier.
Okay. Okay, now back to the ownership, the mainstream media. Are there any outlets that I suppose in the US and in the UK that aren't owned by the or managed by the mainstream media that come to mind?
Not any of them that you would consider mainstream.
Right. Wow. So what can we do?
I don't do what you're doing right now. You're getting information to people from an alternative source, and that's what we can do. That's the reason why I've been doing my podcast. It's the reason why I've been doing all of this research, is because it's going to be on us to educate ourselves.
Yeah.
And kudos to you for doing it, because it is not for the faint of heart.
No, no. And also to you that what people need to do is to follow Colonel Rachel Towner Watkins on X and also her YouTube and her Rumble channel. And you do daily shows, right? A weekday,
At four
every
o'clock East Coast time. Yeah,
4 o'clock East Coast time. Rachel, thank you so much. It's been absolute
sure.
education. And it's all the more important for people to watch independent media like me and like Rachel and many of the others that you'll find on Telegram and YouTube and check them out and verify for yourself. In the meantime, this is Rachel and Rich signing out. All the best. Bye bye.